tricky part about culture, culture is created every single day with every single moment with every single action. Even inaction creates culture, right? And so the tricky part as the executive, every day, every minute, every second, you're tasked with creating culture. It's too hard for my brain, but that is the reality and complexity of running of any nonprofit, certainly of a large cultural institution like Mount Auburn.
Welcome to What Works, where nonprofit leaders share real stories about what makes impact possible and how they can influence their community. I'm your host, Marla Moody, a transformational leadership coach and an author, but I'm also passionate about helping leaders stay clear, resilient, and effective. Today, we're going to explore how a legacy institution evolved to stay meaningful and modern. I'm joined today with Matthew Stevens, President and CEO of Mount Auburn Cemetery. He's reimaging a historic space into a vibrant, living landscape of community, beauty, and connection. If you've ever wondered how to balance tradition with innovation while leading in with long-term impact, this conversation is for you. So get ready. Matthew's here to tell us what works. Welcome, Matthew.
Great to be here and happy to share a little bit of my story, Mount Auburn's story, and we'll share what works and perhaps some of what doesn't work too.
First, I would love for you to give a more vision on Mount Auburn Cemetery and how it really is moving from an active cemetery into continuing with that, but really adding a community element. So let's just start with giving people a vision of what you do.
I'll start with what Mount Auburn is. Maybe
Yes,
we
please.
are almost a 200-year-old cemetery that was founded in Cambridge and Watertown, Massachusetts, as the first rural garden cemetery in the country. So our founders had this really incredible, innovative idea, essentially 200 years ago, that said, let's solve this core social problem of burying the dead. The cemeteries in downtown Boston were starting to fill up after the city was settled. And there was like, well, what are we going to do with the dead? And there was also this concern then around health issues with cemeteries, which we know today isn't true. And so one of our founders, Jacob Bigelow, had this incredible idea. Well, let's find somewhere out in the countryside, out in what have now become the suburbs, to create a cemetery, but let's break the mold. Let's let this place be about nature and inspiration, not just about death. And that very idea, that's part of our DNA, has informed how this incredible organization has evolved for nearly 200 years. Kudos to our founders for having the vision to break the mold around what a cemetery could be then, that has now amplified over the last 200 years and, of course, been replicating. Like if you go to essentially any major city east of the Mississippi River, there's a garden cemetery that was influenced by Mount Auburn Cemetery. We were the first original, over the next 30 or 40 years, people from Cincinnati, people from Brooklyn, people from Philadelphia came to Mount Auburn and said, hey, we should have one of these for our city too. And then up sprouted this whole host of garden cemeteries for decades prior. At the same time, the parks movement started to take root too, right? In the mid-1850s, Central Park was founded. And so simultaneously, you have garden cemeteries expanding with a whole parks movement starting to take root simultaneously, which then the two started to sort of part ways, where cemeteries focused on being just about death and parks became those spaces for public. And Mount Auburn, though, that never really has changed. And to our founders' vision, they had always hoped we would be this place, core social service of serving the burying human remains in the soil. But let's let this place also be about nature and the healing properties of the trees, canopy, monuments, rolling hills. This will make this place special. To answer your question, what do we do today? We do exactly what our founders had hoped, right? We serve this core social service of burying the dead while we're building and activating a public landscape that makes Mount Auburn more than just a cemetery.
Mm. When I think of cemeteries, I do think the history piece of it, but death is an uncomfortable topic.
Yeah.
And to blend the beauty of, like, old cemeteries with the discomfort of in life there's death, even from a marketing standpoint and things like that, how do you help people kinda step into some of that discomfort? You know, they might be out for a picnic and they see a hearse go through. How do you balance?
It is super tricky. Every day there's this tension between our mission, right? Of a place of solace and a place of activation. I think our founders knew that there would be that tension as part of our DNA that we have to manage each and every day, right? Like every day we have active burials, and every day there's bird watchers, or there's people who are studying the trees, or there's people who are here just for a walk because we're 175 acres of green space in two communities that don't have enough green space.
Yeah.
And so that tension is ever present. And Mount Auburn Cemetery, in our name, cemetery, and what most people, aside from our founding and with the parks movement sort of separating, most people have an image of what a cemetery is. And it's funny, I've started to ask people who've never been to Mount Auburn, like, well, what do you think we look like?
Mm,
And people describe two things. They describe Arlington like a cemetery where the monuments are stacked in nice, neat little rows, right? And it's really about death or memorialization. It's not about the landscape or nature. Or they describe a Hollywood cemetery where there's like tumbleweeds and broken monuments. Well, Mount Auburn doesn't look like either of those two things. You know, when you come to Mount Auburn, no matter where you're at in the 175 acres, 95% of what you see is nature. And we've been very intentional and thoughtful for 200 years about curating inspiration and awe as part of this very special place. But you're right, like with daily burials and with like birds floating around or butterflies or big tree, there's this daily tension. And somehow it's like, well, how does it work here? How does that tension coexist where people can have the absolute saddest day of their life with other people having the happiest day of their life? I don't know that I have the answer to that question, but there's something about the beauty or there's something about nature here that somehow absorbs that sadness or solace and transforms it into inspiration. And we're not a religious institution, and maybe there's some sort of spiritual quality to this special landscape, but somehow those two things coexist, and it's hard to describe exactly how or why.
it shows it's real, right? Because with life is simplicity and also that complexity or that duplicity of pain and grief at the same time, and there is something about beauty in burying your loved one in a beautiful spot that's also has solace.
Yeah.
That thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and
What
I think also people just sometimes like grief is so hard.
Yeah.
And we as humans, everyone goes through grief at some point in their life, right? And no one trains you on how to deal with grief, and everyone reacts to grief differently. But there's some parts, some like antidote to grief is just like being able to stop and think about like the sound of wind through the leaves of the trees, or to see a butterfly sort of fluttering along, or to see the way the light reflects off of a monument in this very simple way that brings balance in those moments. Mount Auburn has these like curated moments that happen all the time that help extract or maybe lighten the weight of some of that grief that people carry.
Yeah, I like that absorbing that energy like you mentioned before. With all of this, what keeps you clear on, like, what truly matters, where to put time and energy, knowing this tension?
I would say it's really tricky. Part of the last few years of our work has been to really reimagine what Mount Auburn Cemetery can be, right? And we're really leaning into continue to be an active working cemetery, but also trying to convey we want our community to be here. Like we're open and welcome, even though Mount Auburn, that word cemetery is in our name. We're starting to see by welcoming people, this is a place people want to be. It's not just a place people go when they have to. So a lot of my time and our staff's time over the last few years have been really focused on positioning the messaging around, well, like, it's okay, we want you here. And then we've started to implement projects that enable that to happen. Over the last few years, we've made some significant capital improvements. One very simple and meaningful improvement that's made is we added pedestrian entrances. So we sort of literally cut holes in our fence with an entrance that sort of said with open arms, please come in, you're welcome. We started to do additional programming ranging from meditation or forest bathing to music or movie nights. We even do a light and sound installation in the at nighttime at the month of December. And all that programming really gets people on site once. And what we know is that they have this image of what we are before they visit. If we can get them on site one time, they realize within 30 seconds, we don't look like what they thought we were going to look like.
Yeah.
And also people have very surprisingly low expectations around us, I guess, because we are a cemetery. And so when people come, they're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Like I've never seen anywhere like this ever. And so there's something very disarming about that like shoes on the ground once that really we're working towards. And now that that's started to happen, we're starting to build out like, well, how do we build deeper engagements? How does that one visit translate into a visit to an event or a continued activation? Or maybe for some of those people, how to, over time, that they would feel comfortable and would say, well, I want to be buried here in the ground forever. With that comes this whole series of like, that's change management. We're changing what this legacy organization is. With that comes, how do we fund all of this innovation and exploration of our mission? How do we communicate that to our external stakeholders? How do we communicate to the staff? How do we communicate that to the board, right? And how do we make sure we're all aligned in that effort? That, of course, is a very complex topic. So to make sure you have clear vision and mission, you have a funding strategy to be able to make that happen, and then you have openness in the community to start to digest or consume this tweak on how your mission is manifested.
What are some of the key elements of that change management? How do you go about it? Because change really is usually done with resistance. And you have not only the public, like you said, you have your stakeholders, you have those that work there. Talk a little bit more about that change management element.
Yeah. The good part for me is that I was positioned for success by our boards. And so prior to me arriving, the board had gone through a series of years where they had started asking questions and were like, I think we I think we need to change. And we're not exactly sure how we need to change, but it's clear something's not quite right. And that enabled me to step into this a few years ago. My direction from the board is that something's got to change, but they're not exactly sure what. And so in my first 100 days, you're only new once, right? The good news is in those first 100 days, and I encourage everyone to do this, like ask every question you can imagine, right? Because you're only new once. And you can literally ask anything. You can ask silly questions or far out questions. You can ask questions about staffing, you can ask questions about budgets, you can ask questions about communications, you can ask questions about strategy, you can ask questions about things that have happened in the past, right? When you're new, just ask lots and lots of questions, right? And what I heard back was all sorts of interesting things, like people who had concerns about this, or like, we actually are really, really good at this. Like, don't mess with this. Through that sort of Q&A, there is some concern about our future, right? Sort of reflected as like, and there is this sense of like, what we're doing, we're really good at, but it's a little fragile. And it's not clear what our long-term vision is. And so really, for after that 100-day mark, I sat down with our staff and board, and we started to sort of chart out, we're not going to figure out our long-term 20-year vision in the next like 6 months, because of the legacy organization. It's going to take, it's going to take a few years to really sort of chisel off a really clear vision. But what's clear is an investment phase. We call it an assess and invest phase is really needed. And so we really embarked on assess, like, let's understand where there's risk, or where there are things that are just not working, and let's make investments in resolving those. We did 2 or 3 years of that investment and assessment phase while we embarked on a more collaborative long-term planning effort that started to chart out, well, what is the long-term vision for Mount Auburn Cemetery?
How many employees are there? What types of people work there? How big is it? What do they do? How big is the board?
We've grown a lot over the last 4 years. When I started, I think there were about 75 full-time staff and an operating budget of about 10 million. A board of about 20 people. Today, the operating budget is really pretty much 18 or 19 million. So we've grown by about 80 or 90% in the operating budget over a 4-year period, which is really pretty tremendous growth in the nonprofit world. The staff is really about 120 now, and the board has really stayed about this. With that scale, like 120 staff, we have people who do all sorts of things. Like, we have people who manage the active cemetery business, people who take calls and sell burial space, and uh, bury human remains or set monuments, daily. We have horticulturists and a tree crew who take care of, we have a greenhouse, that sort of take care of this complex 175 acres of green space. We have IT professionals who sort of help us, manage everything. We have marketing and communications professionals. We have fundraisers, and then we have like people who keep the facilities up and running, or monuments preserved in a thoughtful way. So it's its own little mini city of sorts. And then of course that's supplemented with a broad suite of contracted help for all these specialties. Like when a big tree falls down, we don't own a tree crane, so we have to sort of rely on someone who has like a big heavy duty, materials, or there's a series of specialists who help, of course.
So with that diversity, which makes sense, right? With all that you do, how do you keep that vision in front of the different people? Like when you're talking about change management and you're seeing one, that growth. I mean, that's huge growth in 4
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
and growth in both finances and also that. How do you keep that vision in front of them?
Very carefully. And, this is maybe where I've tripped up a little bit, that it is really hard, because we've grown, we've added a lot of FTE over the last few years. So there's just a lot of new voices and faces who are interacting with our mission, who don't necessarily have the organizational perspective of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. We even have 40, upwards of people who've been here for 40 years. And so, they don't, what they don't know, right? But they're still part of our mission in philanthropy or horticulture or preservation, and are trying to do what we hired them to do. And what we've set out are broad stakes in the ground around beauty, service, and welcome. And so our emerging vision even in the first few months, it became very clear beauty, service, and welcome were going to be these key pillars. We've spent a few years building that vision collaboratively. And even today, I wouldn't say that the vision is still fully formed into a perfect ball. It still feels like a ball of clay some days, right? And or maybe it's on the spinning wheel and we're starting to sort of form it into a vase or whatever. And so but we put out very early on beauty, service, welcome as parameters for the person who mows the grass or the person who's like fixing doorknobs here, because it's really important for all of our staff to understand how their individual contributions reflect into what Mount Auburn is today and what it's becoming. Those three pillars were really helpful, I think. And now where we're at, people are craving greater level of but what else, right? And so that's where we're at now, where we're trying to really pencil in at an individual level. Well, here's how you, Sally or Bob or whomever, can contribute to beauty, service, and welcome. And really starting to tie annual goals for individuals into strategic goals or some of those longer term vision goals. And, for an organization that hasn't had that in the past, like clear goal setting, performance evaluation, setting that up in a quickly changing organization has been tricky.
Yeah.
And, I think with each week and month that goes by, we're getting more acute, more nimble at giving that really clear direction so that people understand how their impact for, 40 or 40 plus hours a week translates to where we want to be in 3 years, 5 years, 200 years.
Yeah. Uh, a three-word vision, beauty, service, and welcome, that is something that everybody can remember. I think, one trip I see when people are trying to change or bring vision is they have these long vision
Yeah.
statements that no one can remember. I think we spent 2 years every month making people, like, repeat our little vision statement, which was a good one, except for the fact that no one could remember it. So
Yeah.
I love that 3-tier and then pencil it in.
Yeah.
If you were going to give wisdom to people who wanted to do m management change in their organization, especially as big as what you did, what are some tips that you would give them?
I think number one, there has to be that vision, but it has to be rooted in reality, right? That formation of what do we want to be and why, right? And that why piece you hear from so many people is so important. Like for nonprofits, it's like, well, who are you serving? What are you doing for that constituency? What is your mission about, right? And like we're all smart people and there's a lot of incredible tools that are starting to emerge. We could do this, we could do that. Of course we could, right? But why? And how does that really elevate the impact of what your mission is? And so really careful thought around, well, what is that vision and why? The second piece that comes to mind immediately is don't go at it alone because you'll fail. As the executive, especially, sometimes you feel alone. And, sometimes it feels like you're pulling people along with you versus shepherding people along with you. But, the hope is to sort of shepherd a group of people, staff, board, community, donors, government officials, whoever those people, key people are, you're always going to be further. And, as the leader, you should always be a little further ahead of everyone. But if you end up too far ahead without shepherding people along, it there's going to be problems, right? And so you want to make sure you're always a little bit ahead, but you're not too far out ahead of everyone else, because there's just, especially during change management, you'll end up out on a limb with other people, trying to saw it off. And then I think the third just practical piece is like real, and everyone has to think carefully about, well, if we have this vision or if we have this change, like what are the key, how is that really going to happen, dollars and cents, right? And being practical and pragmatic, but also real about, this is the additional revenue we can generate, or this is where that new revenue is going to come from, is super important. Again, like, we could do this, we could do that. Well, if we can't figure out how to pay for it, or we can't figure out how to leverage philanthropy, it doesn't really matter. And so, and that sort of gets back into like point number one around, is this really feasible? And those are really key questions that keep me up at night, and I spend probably far too much time thinking or worrying about. But that is really how to bring vision from just like a thought bubble into awe or inspiration or meaningful moments that happen here at Mount Auburn.
Yeah, well, very well said, and it kind of follows up my next question. I've started really realizing that leadership comes with invisible pressures. I call it the internal cost of leadership, the things that people don't see. In your role, in your situation right now, like you mentioned, kind of keeps you up at night. What are some of the internal costs of leadership that you face day to day or month to month?
That's a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes in, the internal cost of leadership is, of course, your your just mental bandwidth or energy to engage with whatever else is in your life, with family or friends, and that and there's this famous quote. I'm not the first person to say it. Like, you can have it all, you just can't have it all at the same time,
Mm,
right? And it's so hard to be an excellent executive. It's hard to be an excellent father. It's hard to be an excellent partner, right? And inevitably, those things are all sort of tied together, because you as a human only have so much time, energy, or time or energy, and you have to sleep at least 5 or 6 hours a night.
right. Yeah, no, that's really uh, that's a great perspective because you can't do it all the time,
Nope.
but balancing that and
And
knowing
I think also, but part of that, and this is where I struggle with, is that harmony, balance always feels impossible, because it sort of suggests that there's like static, that
yeah,
variables stop moving. And so I always sort of think of it as like, well, maybe part of that harmony actually makes you a better executive, right? Where you can find that harmony through family or a hike or food or travel. Like, when you go too far extreme in one of those areas, that harmony sort of gets thrown out of whack. And like, if you're really focused on like, well, I'm just going to be the best executive I can be, and like, other areas will suffer, that will impact the harmony of you as that sort of fully balanced executive.
said like a person who loves nature, but it's
Yeah.
true. I've interviewed enough people, and honestly, I got off an interview, we stopped the recording, and I said, "Do you really think a work-life balance is possible?" And he's like, "No." And it's like and so I almost agree with that. I love the word harmony over balance, right? Because there is that push-pull. So it's almost the boundaries more than this balance piece. Like, what would you say? Yeah,
Something at Mount Auburn could change in an instance. Something with my family could change in an instance. Work-life balance, I agree. If someone could just tell me, like, when did that term first start to emerge? It was when the world was different than it is today, right? And all signs suggest the world is going to continue to move faster and faster and faster, which is scary, right, for all of us. So, like, the word balance further suggests like that will be impossible, but this harmony feels more attainable today in a quickly changing world. And then obviously back to Mount Auburn, for our mission, that's why we feel so confident that our mission is in such high demand today and will continue to be in such high demand because the world is going to continue to move faster and faster, and the level of uncertainty that exists today is crazy, right? It doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, or there is a heavy amount of uncertainty in the world. And so having a place like Mount Auburn where you can escape
Absolutely.
to find a moment of reflection or inspiration is just part of that individual harmony that we're all struggling but constantly seeking.
So it's almost like the Mount Auburn Cemetery allows for that personal and community harmony.
Yeah, I mean, and and when I talk to our community or donors, that's why they love our mission, right? Because what we serve, they can't find anywhere else. And when you come here, it is like a portal to somewhere else. And we're in spring now, spring at Mount Auburn Cemetery. You could come here. It should be on people's I have to do before I die list. For the next 6 weeks at Mount Auburn Cemetery, this place is like nowhere else on the planet. You come here, you see fern fronds unfurling, you see warblers sort of flying through the landscape, you see the reflection of water and lights, and it's like everything's going to be okay, right? And I'm
Yeah.
going to be okay. My loved ones are going to be okay. The world's going to be okay. The earth is going to be okay. And like to have that moment of relief in such uncertain times is so powerful.
I I'm gonna highlight that because there is something about nature that reminds us of our humanness.
Yeah. And, I mean, again, some PhD could tell us for millions of years, we all lived in nature, right? Very, very directly. And so we all evolved to have this very dependency and connection to nature that, over the last few hundred years has started to be compartmentalized a little bit, right? And unfortunately, nature has become more rare for far too many people, right? And where like doctors are now prescribing nature to children, right? Like they're going to the doctor and they're like, well, you need to spend more time in nature. And so to our founders' credits, their vision to sort of understand the power of nature in, over 200 years ago, and that we Mount Auburn would be such a need today. And in another 200 years, it's probably going to be even more exaggerated, than it is today. It's like, well, we're feeling very confident in our place, and I think most nonprofit organizations, if they have excellent DNA, it really enables the mission to thrive well beyond whatever the founder's vision ever had expected.
Absolutely. One last question. How do you think leaders can create that more space, either internally or externally, where people can actually pause and reflect?
Yeah, I am not good at this. I think I have
As most
acknowledged
CEOs
I
aren't.
I think I've acknowledged over the years, this is not something I'm really great at. And so I think recognizing if you can or can't do that is step one. If you can't, keep people around you that can.
Hmm,
And so I think part of my team around me, I really do rely on them to sort of like, hey Matthew, we can't just move on to the next thing here. We need to like take a moment and celebrate this like incredible accomplishment. And I think I get too wrapped up in all right, this was awesome. Like, okay, what's next, right? And I'm trying to be more sensitive to that as I grow as an individual leader, but I recognize in myself that that's not my immediate place that I sink into. So I need people around me to sort of help bring those spotlights.
How do you think it would shift for you and your staff and the whole cemetery if you took that on where celebration and you had that as part of your harmony? How would that shift things for you?
Again, that's a great question. I think me as the leader or executive, and I'm really going to try to work on this for the foreseeable
Okay.
future because it starts to change the tone and culture of how this place works. Because if I model that as a key attribute that my staff, board, whoever sees, that affirms that's okay. That's part of who we are. And the tricky part about culture, culture is created every single day, with every single moment, with every single action. Even inaction creates culture, right? And so the tricky part as the executive, every day, every minute, every second, you're tasked with creating culture. It's too hard, or it's too hard for my brain. Like
Mhm.
like if I'm thinking about that constantly, it's distracting me from other things, right? And so, but that is the reality and complexity of running a large culture, of any nonprofit, certainly of a large cultural institution like Mount Auburn. And so part of that trick is like, well, in modeling or showing growth and change as the executive, that sort of inculcates that that's part of who this organization is. That's what it means to be a staff member. That's what it means to be a board member. And so if you set that tone and you can display and model it, I think then you start to really see the amplification of that in the culture. But it's, you have to sort of like, okay, well, if this isn't happening, that's on me. And I need to do my best to change, or I need to do my best to have support, or I need to like tasks, someone with that in the interim phase, or to call me out when I don't do it. That is really a key piece of being a leader, and then having the humility to acknowledge that it's a lifelong learning journey that you're on to become the best leader you can be.
100%. Thank you for sharing that and just the humbleness of that. Because a lot of times what gets us to leadership, which it is that drive, it is the wisdom and the push. And but then once you get to that certain level, then it's like, okay, how do I build culture? Because culture is values and action. Those
Yeah,
2 things build culture, and culture eats strategy for lunch every day of the
every
week.
day. Yeah,
So,
yeah,
thank you for that insight and that humility.
yeah.
Matthew, is there anything you wanna end with as we finish up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, being a leader is so hard, right? And I think whether it's Mount Auburn Cemetery, or a baseball team, your kids' soccer team, or whatever it is, right? That leadership comes in all forms, and it is a hard job, right? And it is, of course, thankless. And hopefully what inspires me, especially here at Mount Auburn, is to see our mission, right? And to experience that in the landscape, or to hear from families how we're impacting them with the delivery of greater service, beauty, or welcome. That's sort of what adds gas back into my tank. And I feel very lucky because I spend a lot of time out in the community or talking to people that our mission impacts, and I get to hear firsthand how special this place is to those people we've touched, right? And those moments where people are so generous and so thankful about our work, it sort of extracts you out of spreadsheets or personnel issue or whatever whatever else is sort of floating around for the day, right? And you're sort of reminded, like, this is why I do this, and this is why I work so hard. And it's nice to have those moments. They're never planned, right? You're just sort of, I'm just in between something, or someone sends an email, and you're just like, wow, this is such a special place. And I think to have those reminders is really a really powerful part of leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for your insight. Thank you for painting a vision of Mount Auburn Cemetery. I'm planning on a road trip and would love to see that. So I'll let you know when that happens.
We're not going anywhere. We're going to be here for hundreds of years. So, but it is a very special very special place, very special landscape. And of course, we'd welcome anyone and everyone to, if they're in the Boston region, to make it part of their visit.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for listening to What Works with Marla Moody. Until next time, stay clear, lead well, and discover what works.